The snow had barely melted in the courtyard of Winterfell, and the evidence of the long night's devastation still lingered everywhere one looked. Timber beams broken into shards jutted from half-collapsed walls. Scorch marks on ancient stone bore witness to Dragonfire's fury, and blackened footprints told the story of fires set to burn the last straggling whites in the final hours of that terrible darkness. Yet for the first time in what felt like an age, the people walked with straighter backs, with a tentative hope gently unfurling in their hearts. The sun's return had never been so welcome. Golden rays piercing the gray northern skies and illuminating a future that had been anything but certain. Even the ravens seemed to cry out in wonder, circling overhead like dark omens, now turned into silent heralds of a new dawn. Winterfell was alive, in spite of all it had endured, and the realm that had gathered behind those walls was preparing for a moment no one could have foreseen. In the great hall, an unsteady calm settled over each corner. Servants moved about with an anxious diligence, polishing the long trestle tables and arranging wooden bowls with humble foods, crusty loaves of bread, stew thick with barley, and a smattering of early spring vegetables pulled from the meager storehouses. Though meager, it was sustenance, and after the trials of the winter that would pass into legend, there was a nearly sacred significance to each bite. The flickering torchlight made the tapestries dance on the walls. One tapestry, more tattered than the rest, still displayed the proud direwolf of House Stark, a reminder of a lineage that had guarded the north for generations. Next to the dais, huge flagons were being filled with wine so that each representative of the great houses might receive some measure of hospitality when they arrived. Winterfell's great hall had once been a simple place, but today it looked almost regal in a quiet, subdued way, perhaps a reflection of the new king's spirit, or at least the spirit of the one who was about to be crowned. Jon Snow stood near the huge hearth, his posture stiff, eyes distant. The dancing flames threw shadows across his face and highlighted the silver streak of a fresh scar across his cheek. He wore the black and gray of House Stark, though there was a new thread of gold embroidered in the edges of his cloak, a small nod to something bigger than even the North, or so Tyrion had advised him. The cloak itself draped heavily around his shoulders, reminding Jon of the weight he was about to bear. His dark hair had grown long over the months, and though he still wore it pulled back, unruly strands fell over his forehead. In the center of the hall, a circle of lords and ladies waited in a hush so profound that every crackle of the fire seemed to echo. Sansa Stark, garbed in an elegant gown of icy gray, stood to Jon's left. Her flaming hair was braided in a style that combined the intricate braiding of the North with the practicality learned from her time in the Vale. A gentle half-smile played on her lips, though her eyes shone with the bittersweet knowledge that though they had won the war, they had lost so much and so many. She squeezed Jon's hand in silent encouragement, an acknowledgement that the next step of their journey was as daunting as any battle they had fought in the long night. Standing to Jon's right was Arya, quiet as ever, observing the lords in front of her with an intensity that made more than one man shift uneasily on his feet. She wore a simple tunic, her sword at her hip, refusing to dress like a lady of a great house. Yet in her steel-gray gaze was a fierce devotion to her brother. He might be her cousin by blood, but in every sense that mattered, Jon was family. Across the hall, Tyrion Lannister stood with his hands clasped behind his back, wearing deep crimson accented with black. He looked to Jon frequently, as if gauging how the man handled the mounting pressure. Tyrion had not slept well for months, even though the immediate threat of the dead was gone, because the political game that followed was almost equally fraught with peril. Nonetheless, he managed a small reassuring nod in Jon's direction, a reminder to be strong and to trust that the realm's choice was justified. Behind Tyrion, Brienne of Tarth stood, tall and imposing in gleaming armor. She had refused to remove the dents and scrapes that bore testament to her role in the battles. Her sword belt was polished, the hilt glinting with promise, and her expression offered silent approval. As the assembled lords murmured among themselves, the heavy doors of the hall were pushed open by a pair of northern guards. The voice of the steward rang out, announcing the arrival of one great house after another. Lords from the Vale, from the Stormlands, and from the Riverlands filed in, each accompanied by household knights or heirs. Some faces were solemn, others openly curious. Lady Yara Greyjoy arrived from Pike, standing alone to represent the Iron Islands, her dark eyes scanning the room with cautious respect. Gendry Baratheon, newly legitimized, entered with an uncertain step, still finding his place among the Highborn after forging his identity, first as a blacksmith, then as a soldier. The scattered lines of Dorne's new leadership were represented by a young woman who wore a bright sun and spear sigil pinned over her left breast, her serene face disguising the swirling calculations that the lords of Dorne had taught her. One by one they gathered around the great hall, forming a loose ring that left an open space before the dais, where Jon Snow would soon stand as both a Stark of Winterfell and the chosen ruler of Westeros. Across the courtyard, outside the hall, Ghost padded quietly through remnants of snow. The direwolf's thick white fur was mottled with a few still healing wounds. He sniffed at the air, attuned to the gathering energies inside, but did not enter. Ghost was never particularly comfortable in large crowds, and after the horrors he had faced alongside Jon, he seemed to prefer the open air, away from the swirl of politics and ceremony. Even so, his presence was a reminder of the bond between man and direwolf, and a sign of that ancient northern mysticism that had, in no small way, contributed to Jon's moral compass. In the corridor leading to the Great Hall, Daenerys Targaryen's name had once been spoken in hushed reverence. Though she had lost 2 dragons and so many of her loyal followers, and although her path had been fraught with heartbreak and mistakes, she had joined the fight against the undead with relentless determination. The realm had since learned of her complicated destiny and her closeness to Jon. She was gone now. Some said she had returned to Essos to rebuild. Others claimed she had died tragically in the aftermath of the battle. Stories varied, and few dared speak her name in the presence of certain lords for fear of rekindling old resentments. Yet her absence was palpable, especially for Jon. Only time would show whether her flame had truly been snuffed out, or if it still flickered somewhere across the sea. For the moment, the hush in Winterfell told the realm's living that this ceremony belonged to someone else. Jon Snow, the man who had once known nothing, stood amid the swirl of courtiers, knights, and lords. He remembered how, long ago, he had felt out of place anywhere south of the Neck. Yet here were people from every corner of the kingdom, all converging under one roof to declare him king. It was a moment laced with irony, and with a gravity that made his heart pound. He thought back to the darkness beyond the wall, the many nights of dread, and the unending cold that cut to the bone. He had known the threat of the Night King long before the Southern lords believed the tales. He had done all he could to unite men against the impending doom. Now, after unspeakable losses, here they stood, breathing the same air that had once been thick with hopelessness. Samwell Tarly, who had journeyed all the way from the Citadel and then braved the war in the north, stepped forward with a small book clutched to his chest. His face was pallid with nerves, but a determined light shone in his eyes. He looked at Jon the way one might look at a dear friend who has accomplished the impossible. Carefully, he opened the book, scanning the pages until he found the passage he sought. In the hush, Sam's voice shook just a bit. He began to speak of the traditions of crowning in Westeros, the ceremonies of old, the blessings that might accompany a king's ascension, and the uniting of great houses under a single banner for the sake of the realm's future. It was a quiet speech, yet one that resonated, for in these words was the core of what Westeros needed: unity after centuries of bitter conflict and war. Tyrion stepped forward next. His voice, practiced in the ways of oration, rang through the hall with unexpected clarity. He spoke of the war they had fought together, of the need for understanding that the crown was not a mere trophy but a mantle of duty heavier than any armor. He spoke of the long night, how it had tested their souls in ways no one had ever foreseen. And he spoke of the future, which belonged to the living. Jon watched Tyrion carefully, recalling their first meetings all those years ago, and how much had transpired since then. Enemies turning into allies, families broken and reformed, loyalties tested by war and prophecy alike. When Tyrion finished, the silence that followed was poignant. Every soul in the hall, aware that they stood on the brink of a new era. Sansa then cast her gaze around the assembled lords. She spoke quietly but firmly, reciting how Jon Snow once a bastard by name, had proven himself time and again, from the Wall to the Battle of the Bastards, from the parley with Cersei Lannister to the forging of alliances necessary to defeat the Night King. She said his name and called him brother, in a voice that softened some of the haughtiest in the room. When she concluded, she inclined her head, a gesture that was at once regal and deeply personal, as though she were surrendering the weight of Winterfell's leadership to the man who had saved them all. Gendry took a hesitant step forward, clearing his throat. He was unused to formal speech, especially in such a gathering. Yet he spoke earnestly of how Jon had accepted him when others would not, how Jon had placed trust in him and recognized his potential, forging a bond that would outlast the battles they had fought. Yara Greyjoy, though with fewer words, offered a blunt statement of trust in Beowulf, who came to the Iron Islands as an ally instead of a conqueror. A ripple of agreement passed among those who had known only war, until the day they set aside their old grievances to fight for the survival of the realm. One by one, the representatives of the great houses added their voices, however brief. From the Stormlands, from the Reach, from Dorne, from the Vale and the Riverlands. Their support was not all equal. Some with caution, some with genuine admiration, some with the hope of forging new alliances in a changed world. In the middle of it all, Jon found it difficult to breathe. He recalled every face, every name, every title offered, feeling the momentary dizziness of a man who had never dreamed such a day would come. There was no joy in this acceptance, only a solemn sense of responsibility. If he was to lead, it would be for the sake of those who had fallen, to ensure their sacrifice was not wasted. Finally, silence returned. The last echoes of the Lord's voices dissipated like wisps of smoke. The air was heavy with anticipation. Slowly, Samwell approached once more, carrying a simple crown fashioned from interwoven swords melted down from the weapons of the undead that had once threatened them all, symbolically hammered into something new by the realm's blacksmiths. The metal had a gray sheen, with occasional glints of silver under the torchlight. In its forging, the people found a powerful reminder that they could transform even the darkest threats into a promise of unity. The crown was not jewel-encrusted, nor polished to a gleam. It was rugged, almost stark in its appearance, yet quietly beautiful. Jon took a half-step back as though overwhelmed by the sight of it. A tightness formed in his throat, and he heard his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. But then, with a slow, measured breath, he knelt. The hall erupted in a whisper of stirring fabric as every lord and lady leaned forward. Samwell, trembling yet resolute, lifted the crown carefully, as though it were the most precious relic in all the world. He placed it upon Jon's head and stepped back, eyes moist with a mixture of relief and pride. In that pause, a soft breeze seemed to drift through the hall, carrying the warmth of the hearth and the subtle scent of fresh pine from outside. To some it felt as though the old gods were acknowledging the moment, and a few glanced upward, half expecting to feel a presence. But the solemn hush remained unbroken until Tyrion declared, in a voice loud enough to carry to the rafters, "All hail Jon of House Stark, King of the Realm, our King of the Living." A thunderous echo of voices rose up. People repeated the refrain, some with fervent devotion, others with cautious acceptance. The volume surged, filling the great hall until it seemed the stones themselves might resonate with this collective proclamation. Trumpets blared from the courtyard, and somewhere outside, Ghost lifted his muzzle to the sky and howled. It was not an eerie wail as it had once been on the night of battles, but something more triumphant, a wild cry that rippled through the winter air. The name of the new king spread among the crowds gathered beyond the hall, peasants and soldiers alike, many of them bruised and exhausted from weeks of fighting and mourning. Yet they too joined the cry, because if there was one thing that could unite them in this fragile moment, it was the shared hope that tomorrow would not be as dark as the nights they had survived. Jon Snow slowly rose to his feet, the crown heavy upon his brow, shoulders squared despite the invisible weight bearing down on them. He swallowed hard, meeting the eyes of those before him. Sansa's quiet pride, Arya's unwavering loyalty, Tyrion's strategic approval, Sam's brotherly admiration. He shifted his gaze to the newly assembled representatives of the great houses, and saw something resembling belief, or at least willingness. And for the first time in his life, Jon allowed himself a moment of true acceptance. He accepted that his place was among them, that he was no longer the outsider, the bastard, or the unwanted. He was king, made so by the living souls who chose him, and whatever future lay ahead, it would be his to guide. He lifted his head. "My lords," he began, his voice low and even, echoing in the hush that followed the applause. "My ladies, you have placed your faith in me, a man who once took the black, who was once no more than a bastard. I vow to honor that faith. We all have seen the cost of division. We have stood at the brink of extinction, and it was only by coming together that we survived. May we remember that if we stand as one, there is nothing we cannot endure." He paused, measuring each word as if forging a promise. "I will not promise endless summer. I will not promise that our hardships are over. But I will promise this: as long as I draw breath, I will do all in my power to keep us united, to safeguard every corner of this realm. We have lost too many. For them, we must strive to build a better world." None. For a moment, emotion welled in him, recalling the fallen, his brothers of the Night's Watch, the men and women Hend fought beside, even those who had once been enemies, but died so that the living might have a future. But he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. The lords nodded in solemn agreement. The hush that fell was not of uncertainty, but of acknowledgement. They had chosen him for this exact humility, this steadfastness that had carried them through the darkest winter anyone could remember. Afterward, the gathering began to shift into a subdued celebration. Bowls of spiced wine were passed around, and the clink of wooden cups punctuated soft laughter. People embraced old friends, while some used this moment to negotiate alliances in hushed corners. The war might be over, but the Game of Thrones hardly rested. At the center, a cluster formed around Jon, everyone eager to speak with him, to introduce themselves formally, or to pledge fealty in a more personal manner. Lords from the Reach bowed, the new head of House Tarly giving a respectful inclination of his head. The men of the Vale placed a hand to their hearts. Yara Greyjoy gave Jon a firm handshake, a ghost of a grin tugging at her lips. The representatives from Dorne exchanged quiet courtesies with the Northern King, their words laden with a promise to keep old tensions buried where they belonged, in the grave of the Long Night. Sansa oversaw much of the proceedings from a slight distance, ensuring that everything remained orderly. She skillfully guided over-enthusiastic supplicants away when Jon needed a moment, offered gracious words to those who looked anxious, and gave subtle direction to the servants circulating with refreshments. Tyrion, meanwhile, found himself in conversation with lords from the Riverlands, smoothing out any residual wariness they might harbor toward a Lannister. Brienne, never comfortable in the role of socialite, stood near the dais, watchful and ready to intervene if any situation became too tense. Across the room, Arya drifted like a silent shadow, eyes scanning the crowd, never staying in one place too long. She carried no illusions about the fragility of peace. Time slipped by, and the torches burned lower. The doors to the courtyard remained open, letting in fresh air and a mild draft. People moved in and out, sometimes for respite from the throng, sometimes for a quiet word away from listening ears. It was in one such alcove that Jon found himself leaning against a stone pillar, breathing in the cool northern wind. The crown still weighed upon his head, and he could feel the slight discomfort of the metal pressing into his dark hair. He closed his eyes, trying to steady the racing of his thoughts. When he opened them again, Sansa was beside him. She laid a gentle hand on his arm, an empathetic smile touching her lips. "You look burdened," she observed softly. Jon let out a small sigh. "I am burdened. I never wanted this. I did what I thought was right, because it was the only thing I could do. Now, I bear the hope of so many. I only wonder if I can be what they need me to be." Nentensi. Sansa's gaze flitted to the crowd inside. "You are exactly what they need. You are someone who has knelt before no cause other than the safety of the realm. You have seen truths that others refuse to see, and you led them through a night no one believed we could survive. If that does not deserve their loyalty, I don't know what does." Her words offered solace, and Jon nodded, though the tension in his jaw did not fully lessen. "I'm grateful you're here," he said quietly. "And Arya Bran, wherever he roams these days. I wouldn't have agreed to any of this if I were alone." Bran. A flicker of sadness crossed Sansa's face at the mention of Bran, but it was quickly tempered by pride in her remaining family. "We Starks have endured more than most," she said, "but we endure together. Now, come back in. Your new subjects would see their king smile, even if just for a moment." Jon mustered a faint smile and followed Sansa back into the hall, past the crowd. People raised their cups, in subtle salute. The king acknowledged them with a slight incline of his head. He sensed their goodwill, but he also knew how quickly loyalties could shift if the realm faced another crisis. That, however, was a concern for a future day. For now, as soft music began to play, some northern ballad accompanied by the faint strumming of a lute, there was a rare sense of peace in these walls. Night deepened over Winterfell. Stars pricked the sky, a velvet tapestry of brilliant points of light, clean and sharp after the storms of the winter had dissipated. The courtyard, once filled with bodies and the gore of battle, was swept, and lanterns now lined the walls. Soldiers on watch duty stood at their posts with a mixture of pride and weariness, gazing out into the darkness beyond the gates. For a moment, the north almost resembled a place of quiet respite, a realm healing from its wounds. The ghosts of the battle still lingered, but each breath of the crisp air felt like an affirmation that life would continue. When the hour grew late, some lords found chambers prepared for them, though Winterfell had limited space. Others pitched tents in the bailey or in fields just outside the castle, where small fires burned in circles, casting a warm glow. Night birds called across the expanse of snow-dappled land, and the wind carried their cries into the distance. This was the lull after the storm, the first taste of normalcy in a world that had nearly ended. Jon, feeling the press of the crown too heavy to bear in closed rooms, ventured outside to clear his head. He found Ghost waiting by the well, the direwolf eyes reflecting the moonlight. The great beast padded forward, pressing his muzzle into Jon's hand. Jon knelt, resting his forehead against the direwolf's thick fur, and in that moment, king and beast were one. No lords, no crowns, no obligations, just the bond that had carried them both through battle and heartbreak. Ghost huffed softly, ears pricking at a distant sound. Jon rose, following the direwolf's gaze, only to see Arya leaning against a pillar of the castle ramparts, quietly observing. She said nothing, but her faint smile told Jon she understood his need for solitude. The two siblings, shaped by so much tragedy, shared a wordless moment beneath the northern sky. Arya's gaze flickered to Ghost, and Jon thought he saw a trace of the wonder she had felt as a child when direwolves were first found in the snow. Then, almost as silently as she had appeared, Arya turned and vanished back into the torchlit corridor, leaving Jon alone with Ghost once more. Jon walked past the gates of Winterfell, stepping just beyond the walls. The night air carried the scent of pine and the lingering trace of wood smoke. He gazed up at the full moon, bright enough to illuminate the surrounding hills. Memories flooded him, the wall looming overhead, the endless white wastes of the far north, the night he had stood watch at Hardhome and first glimpsed the unstoppable terror of the Night King's army. Then he thought of Daenerys, her fierce determination, her dream of breaking the wheel, of freeing people from tyranny. He recalled the quiet strength of his father, or the man he'd believed to be his father, Ned Stark. He had so many reasons to be humble, so many reasons to hold this new responsibility with the utmost caution. Though they called him king, he still felt the watchful eyes of those who had guided him, living and dead alike. Morning light eventually pried open the horizon, bathing Winterfell in pale gold. The new day found Jon already awake, conferring with Tyrion, Sansa, and a handful of other advisors in the Solar. A large table dominated the space, covered in maps of the 7 kingdoms, some so old that the ink had faded, others recently drawn to reflect the new alliances and territories. This was the part of kingship that was less glory and more labor: the rebuilding, the rationing of supplies, the negotiation of who would remain in which castle, and ensuring that the starving would be fed after the harsh winter. Sansa, always attentive to details, spoke at length about food stores and the possibility of importing from the southern regions that had been less affected by the storms. Tyrion pointed out the need to reorganize the crown's finances, especially now that King's Landing was still half in ruins after the wars. The lords present listened, though some fidgeted, clearly unaccustomed to or uninterested in such practicalities. Yet this was the necessary work if Westeros was to become strong again. Jon listened intently, interjecting only when necessary. He had never been one for extended debates, but he recognized that each voice needed to be heard. At times, he glanced at Arya, who leaned against the wall, arms crossed. She caught his eye and shrugged imperceptibly. Politics did not excite her any more than it excited Jon, but she was there for him. Brienne, standing guard near the door, nodded to him when she noticed his gaze. She too understood the weight of duty, having devoted her life to oaths sworn and promises kept. They spoke of possible tensions that might rise in the Reach, of certain lords who might test the new king's will. They discussed how to handle succession in houses that had lost their main bloodlines. They argued about how many soldiers should remain in the north to protect against any lingering threat from beyond the wall, though the Night King was gone. The conversation turned to King's Landing itself, which had once been the seat of power, but was now physically and symbolically scarred. Tyrion advocated for partial rebuilding. Sansa ventured that the capital might someday shift north, or perhaps to another region entirely, given the damage. Jon listened, but found it difficult to picture the city that had once consumed the realm's attention. Perhaps it was time for more balanced representation, to ensure no one place held absolute sway over the others. When they finally adjourned, the day was nearly half gone. Jon stepped out into the sunlight, letting the mild warmth of spring touch his skin. He realized how foreign warmth felt after so many months of darkness and cold. The courtyard was lively, filled with lords preparing for their departure back to their respective seats. Horses were saddled, supplies loaded. Hasty farewells were exchanged, and many promised to return or to call upon the new king in due time. The realm had crowned him, but that did not mean they would remain idle in Winterfell indefinitely. Life had to move forward, and so each region would carry the news home and begin the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. Before Gendry departed for the Stormlands, he approached Jon with a respectful dip of his head. "Your Grace," he said, still a bit awkward with formal titles. "I'll be returning to Storm's End soon, but if there is anything you need from me, you have only to send word. I owe you my life, several times over." Jon clapped Gendry on the shoulder in a friendly gesture. "Take care of your people. That's what matters now. Storm's End will need a leader as stout-hearted as its walls. You have all the skill you need, Gendry." Nandagos. A small smile crossed Gendry's face, and he mounted his horse. Jon watched him ride out the gates with a retinue of Stormlanders. One by one, the delegations departed until Winterfell's courtyard felt less crowded, the press of bodies loosening. Some visitors, including Tyrion and a handful of advisors, remained. So too did the loyal northern lords. Sansa, Arya, and Brienne were not leaving anytime soon, forming the core of Jon's immediate circle. He felt gratitude that in this swirl of change, the people he trusted most remained at his side. The day wore on, soft breezes rolling through the castle. Jon walked the walls of Winterfell, pausing to greet guards, many of whom he recognized from the battles. Some had fresh bandages or limps that would likely follow them for the rest of their lives. They saluted him with respect that was once reserved for the Lord of Winterfell, and now for their king. He offered them kind words, reminding them that their service was appreciated, that they were not forgotten. Down in the training yard, steel rang against steel, for some knights who stayed behind were using the lull to practice. A new generation of fighters began to train, a few of them too young to have fought in the long night, but old enough to grasp a sword's hilt for the first time. Jon observed, remembering how he had once been the uncertain boy under the watchful eye of Sir Roderick Castle, learning the basics. He quietly asked Brienne to see that these newcomers received proper guidance. She accepted without hesitation, for she had sworn to uphold the memory of honorable knights, and to ensure the next generation could defend the realm if ever darkness returned. In the great library, Sam pored over texts both ancient and new, searching for knowledge that might guide Joan's reign. He believed that though the immediate threat of the White Walkers had ended, the realm should never be caught unaware again. There could be more secrets hidden in old manuscripts, more about Targaryen lineage or about the Dawn Age, and the magic that had once permeated the land. Sam greeted Jon warmly when he entered, explaining in excited tones that some of these volumes had not been opened in centuries. Jon listened, though much of the talk of arcane lore still felt alien to him. Yet he trusted Sam's judgment, for that curiosity had saved their lives on more than one occasion. Over dinner, a modest affair of stewed vegetables, roast venison, and fresh bread, Jon sat with his closest companions. Tyrion, ever the conversationalist, asked sly questions about the shape of the future court, possibly hinting at a desire to serve as Hand of the King. Sansa offered her insights into forging stronger alliances through trade rather than marriage pacts, which had caused so much strife in past generations. Arya ate quietly, occasionally darting her gaze over the heads of passing servants, as if she could read potential threats in the flicker of their expressions. Brienne took her meal in calm silence, though she listened intently, as if memorizing every word for future use. It was a subdued gathering, lacking the raucous laughter one might have expected in a time of celebration. But the shadow of the long night was not so easily lifted. Only time could thaw hearts left frozen by death and destruction. Afterward, Jon excused himself early, stepping out to the ramparts to watch the sky fade into twilight once again. The crisp air stung his cheeks. He thought about what it meant to hold a kingdom together. He thought about the vow he made, to protect the people, all the people, regardless of banners or birthplace. He wondered whether the kingdom should remain a single entity, or whether the North might prefer its independence, as it had so often demanded. Yet the long night had proven that humanity could not afford divisions in the face of existential threats. Ultimately, Jon knew he must tread carefully, respect each region's identity while maintaining unity where it mattered most. In the distance, beyond the towers of Winterfell, hills rolled under starlight, and the wind carried faint echoes of hooves and the rustling of winter-bare trees. Jon rested a hand on the cold stone battlements. If he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the quiet hymn of the old gods, a gentle thrumming that underscored the seriousness of his destiny. Perhaps it was just his imagination, the echo of old stories and beliefs etched into the bedrock of the North. Still, it comforted him, reminding him that he was not the first Stark to shoulder a monumental burden, nor would he be the last. A voice broke the silence. "Your Grace." It was Brienne, stepping onto the rampart to stand beside him. Jon turned, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "Sir Brienne." The tall knight paused, choosing her words with care. "I wish to say that I see you struggle with this new mantle, but I also see that you do so with the honor of your house. I once served House Stark by guarding your mother and your sister. I have sworn vows that I still uphold, as best I can. If you will it, I shall swear myself to your service directly. As king, you will need a Kingsguard of your choosing." "Dan." Jon studied her face. He remembered the day Brienne had arrived at Winterfell, battered yet unbroken, pledging her sword to protect the Stark girls. He recalled how she had fought valiantly against the odds, had shown unwavering loyalty time and again. He nodded slowly, touched by her offer. "I would be honored," he said simply, "though I fear my reign will not be free of turmoil." Brienne nodded, a hint of a smile softening her usual stoic expression. "No kingship ever is, Your Grace. I have no illusions. But I believe in you, as I believe in Lady Catelyn, in Lady Sansa, and in your family's commitment to protecting the realm." Jon bowed his head in gratitude. Then the two stood in companionable silence, looking over the battlements at the flickering lights in the courtyard below. In the gloom of night, Winterfell's torches glowed like distant stars, reflecting off patches of lingering snow. The hush was not eerie now, but peaceful, a lullaby of gentle winds weaving through the ancient stone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Letters would be sent to the far corners of Westeros. Steps would be taken to rebuild the shattered realms. Each day would require careful diplomacy, vigilance against opportunists, compassion for the wounded. Jon would have to make decisions that risked angering old families, while also forging new bonds with the younger generation who had not yet learned to hate their neighbors. The memory of the long night should unify them, but memory was fickle, and men often forgot their darkest nightmares once the dawn came. This, above all, was the task of the new king: to keep that fragile sense of unity alive, to remind them that they stood strongest when they stood together. Jon drew in a deep breath of cold northern air, tasting it on his tongue. He felt the rigid weight of the crown, felt the swirl of hopes and fears surging in his mind, and in that moment, he accepted fully that he was no longer merely Jon Snow, no longer the unknown child at Winterfell or the earnest member of the Night's Watch. He was a king, chosen not by ancient birthright alone, but by the voices of those who had witnessed his courage, his honor, and his sacrifice. He would do whatever it took to be worthy of that faith. At length he bid Brienne good night and made his way to his private chambers, passing torches and guards, who saluted him with respectful bows. On the threshold of his door, he paused, looking down the corridor where shadows danced in the torchlight. He remembered the boy he had been, stepping through these halls, uncertain of his place in the world. Now he carried the weight of kings, the burden of a realm's hope. He entered the room, setting the crown reverently on a wooden stand. A single candle flickered on the bedside table. He sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion pulling at him like a physical weight, yet he knew sleep would not come easily. His mind reeled with the responsibilities waiting for him beyond the dawn. He lay down, the blankets cool against his weary limbs. The flickering candlelight painted shifting shapes across the ceiling. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to rest. In his dreams, he walked again in fields of snow under an infinite night sky. He saw old faces: Ned Stark, Sam, Tyrion, Daenerys, and so many others, turning to him, whispering words he couldn't quite hear. Yet their eyes offered trust, a silent urging. And at the end of his dream, he glimpsed a distant springtime, flowers blooming across an open plain. A faint warmth spread through him, a reminder that even the harshest winter yields to life in time. And so, under the protective walls of Winterfell, surrounded by those he called family, and those who would become his new supporters, King Jon Snow rested as best he could. Outside, the night hummed with the quiet songs of the north, and the realm, scarred but hopeful, began to imagine a future under the rule of the man they had crowned. The man who had once known nothing but now carried the wisdom of the darkest night within him. And thus began the reign of a king unlike any Westeros had ever seen. In the days that followed, a hush seemed to settle over Winterfell, one born of reflection rather than fear. The great houses had largely dispersed, each returning to their lands with newly forged promises to uphold the fragile unity they had achieved. Only a few key figures lingered in the north, forming the foundation of Jon's emerging council. The departing banners had left quiet spaces in the courtyard and along the battlements. Though the sun now shone on the old stones, there was still a solemnity in the air, as though the castle itself was processing all that had happened during the long night and the crowning of a new king. Jon rose each morning before the sun fully crested the horizon. He had developed the habit during his years on the wall and saw no reason to break it now that he wore a crown. That early hour felt like his only moment of solitude before the demands of rulership claimed every waking breath. In these half-lit moments, he would stand at the window of his chambers, clad in plain breeches and a woolen tunic, watching the sky transition from purple to pale gold. Winterfell's courtyard below was mostly empty, aside from the watchful presence of guards. Yet he could hear the faint rattle of armor as the men changed shifts, and the quiet bustle of servants beginning their tasks. The crown itself rested on a polished wooden stand near his bed, where it glinted dully in the dim light. He rarely wore it, except for official gatherings. It felt foreign on his head, like an ornament meant for someone else. He allowed himself a single cup of mulled cider or weak ale, sipping it slowly, while the new day spread through the castle. In the corner of his room, Ghost dozed on a small rug, ears occasionally twitching at distant sounds. John would sometimes kneel to run a hand through the direwolf's thick fur, taking comfort in the warmth of his companion. Ghost had remained closer than ever, perhaps sensing the unspoken weight of Joan's responsibilities. The beast's presence was a reminder that he was still of the North, still the man who had grown up on the edges of acceptance, still the same soul who had walked the bitter cold of the Frostfangs. On one such morning, John decided to take Ghost for a walk along the western walls. The day was crisp but not freezing, the air fresh with the scent of pine and turned earth. They passed a handful of guards, all of whom saluted with obvious respect, though they glanced at the direwolf with wary admiration. Ghost walked at Joan's side with quiet grace, his red eyes scanning the horizon. Beyond the walls, the land stretched in gentle, uneven slopes, dusted by the remnants of snow. John gazed out, noticing how the ice receded day by day, leaving patches of dark ground in its wake. Not long ago, the snow's head seemed eternal, a harbinger of the endless night. Now, there was a future taking shape in that thaw, uncertain and delicate, but undeniably present. He felt someone approach behind him and turned to see Arya, cloaked in dark leather, hair braided simply behind her head. She said nothing at first, merely joining him at the battlements. Together, they looked over the countryside, the early light illuminating the distant tree line. A silence passed between them, the kind of stillness only siblings could share comfortably. Ghost sniffed at Arya's boots, then returned to John's side. Arya leaned forward on the cold stone ledge. "They say the snows might be fully gone by next moon," she remarked, voice calm and low. John nodded, resting his forearms on the battlement. "Spring in the north is never certain," he replied. "But maybe we've earned a reprieve." A small smile curved Arya's lips, though shadows lingered in her eyes. "A reprieve is good, as long as it lasts. How are you finding your new duties, Your Grace?" He exhaled a short, humorless chuckle. "You know you don't have to call me that. Maybe I enjoy teasing you." She said it without malice, her smile widening just a bit. "You look tired," she continued more gently. "I see you pacing the corridors at night. You talk to the guards, check the gates, then vanish into the library or some council meeting." John took a moment before responding. "There's a lot to be done. Every day, I meet with Tyrion, Sansa, and a group of advisors. We're trying to organize supplies, figure out how to get more seeds from the Reach, plan the rebuilding of roads. We've also been talking about a new seat of governance, or at least how to handle King's Landing after everything that happened. Tyrion thinks we should send engineers and workers to begin clearing the rubble and start anew. But I'm not convinced we should pour resources into it so soon." "Nemafter." Arya tilted her head. "Rebuilding is necessary, but the realm is fragile. Too much strain on one region might make others resentful." "Nanreme." That's exactly what Sansa says," John noted with a rueful twist of his mouth. "She's been helping me parse through the complexities. She's good at it, better than I am at least. But we need to decide soon. Houses are looking to me for guidance, and I don't want them to think I'm too uncertain to act." Arya studied his face. "Uncertainty isn't weakness, John. You've always been cautious, and that caution has saved lives. It'll serve you well now." "Nay." They stood in shared quiet for a moment longer, the morning sun climbing higher behind them. Then, Arya straightened. "I'm heading out on a patrol with a few of the guard. There are rumors of wild animals roaming too close to the outlying farms. Wolves or bears driven south by the battles maybe. I need to see if the rumors are true." John nodded. "Be safe, Arya." A faint grin crossed her lips as she turned away, heading for the courtyard. John watched her go, struck by how effortlessly she moved, how she seemed more shadow than flesh at times. He would never cease to be amazed by the path she had taken, or how fiercely she protected those she cared about. Ghost let out a low sound, nudging Joan's hand. With one last look at the horizon, John turned and began to make his way down the winding stone steps into Winterfell's heart. In the great hall, He found Tyrion waiting with Brienne and a handful of scribes. The hall felt more spacious now that the visiting lords had departed, its echoes less imposing. The embroidered banners on the walls were newly repaired, and the large fireplace crackled with a modest fire to ward off the morning chill. Tyrion stood at a long wooden table, a spread of letters and parchments piled before him. Brienne stood at his side, looming as silently as a pillar in her gleaming though dented armor. She offered Jon a respectful nod, one hand resting lightly on the pommel of her sword. Tyrion stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Grace, good morning," he greeted. "We have an urgent matter from the Riverlands. A local lord claims raiders, remnants of the wars, possibly bandits who parted from the defeated Lannister or Golden Company forces, are terrorizing villages near Harrenhal." "Naubern?" Jon's brows knitted. "How many raiders?" Tyrion scanned one of the letters. "It's not entirely clear. Lord Mooten speaks of a band that may number in the dozens, well-armed, perhaps veterans from various skirmishes. They steal what little remains of the harvest and vanish into the woods, leaving burned ruins behind." Jon's jaw tightened. Harrenhal had been the site of endless strife for years. It felt like ill fate clung to that monstrous ruin. "We need to put a stop to it," he said simply. "Inform the local lords they have the Crown's support in mustering a defense. But we must do more than that. If the realm is to heal, we can't ignore lawlessness. Who can we send?" Brienne spoke with quiet conviction. "I volunteer, Your Grace. I swore to uphold the realm's peace. I would ride south to Harrenhal and see if we can drive out these raiders." Jon inclined his head, considering. "Tyrion, any concerns if we send Brienne with a small force?" Tyrion folded his hands behind his back. "We should be careful not to deplete Winterfell's defenses too much, but the immediate threat of the undead is gone, and the north is relatively secure. A moderate contingent led by Sir Brienne could be enough to deal with the bandits. Perhaps we also send a trusted commander from the north to ensure local lords see this as the king's direct intervention." Jon nodded in agreement. "Very well. Sir Brienne, choose 20 good men, no more. Pick those who have the resolve for a mission like this. Try to coordinate with local Riverlands forces. Sir Edmure Tully might offer assistance if they've recovered enough from the fight." Jon nodded in agreement. "Very well. Sir Brienne, choose 20 good men, no more. Pick those who have the resolve for a mission like this. Try to coordinate with the local Riverlands forces. Sir Edmure Tully might offer assistance if they've recovered enough from the wars. Be sure to keep me informed, and if you need reinforcements, send a raven immediately." Brienne inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will do my utmost to bring these raiders to justice." "Nisena." Tyrion added a quick note to one of the parchments on the table, then folded it and handed it to a scribe for dispatch. He offered Brienne a small, grateful smile. "Your reputation alone will go far in bringing order to the Riverlands." She made no reply beyond the faintest hint of acknowledgement in her eyes. With a respectful bow, she turned on her heel and exited the hall, her steps measured and confident. Jon watched her go, mindful of the many burdens that still lay ahead. Though the nightmare of the White Walkers had passed, Westeros was far from tranquil. Bands of lawless men, broken sellswords, and deserters from defeated armies still roamed the countryside in many regions. It would take patience, resources, and strong leadership to root out every last threat. Tyrion shuffled a few more papers, then turned back to Jon with a pensive look. "There's still the question of King's Landing," he began, clearing his throat. "We've had reports of disease spreading in certain parts of the city where the rubble is worst. Entire blocks remain destroyed from dragonfire, and many of the small folk are in desperate need of shelter." "Now, Ning. Jon pressed his lips together, recalling the devastation he had witnessed there. "We can't leave them to suffer. Whatever my personal feelings about that city, it's still part of the realm. What do you recommend?" Tyrion tapped a finger on the table. "We might dispatch a royal envoy to oversee the initial efforts. Engineers, healers, workers skilled in clearing debris. It would be wise to ensure the city is habitable again, at least enough to give the small folk some sense of hope." "Now who would lead such a task?" Jon asked, shifting his weight. "It needs to be someone trusted, someone who can coordinate with the lords and guildmasters who remain there. Tyrion considered for a moment. Gendry Baratheon might be a worthy choice. He's newly acknowledged as a legitimate heir, and House Baratheon has claim to the Stormlands, but King's Landing was also once the seat of his father's power. Gendry has shown competence and fairness. With the right advisors around him, he could oversee the cleanup. Jon frowned. I don't wish to bury him in responsibilities so soon. He's still learning to manage the Stormlands. True, Tyrion conceded. Alternatively, we could send someone from the north, but that might appear like an overreach of your direct authority in a region that traditionally sees itself as separate from the north. No matter your name or your crown, people will be wary. It might be better to choose someone local, or at least from the Crownlands. Jon let out a slow breath. I'll think on it. We should speak with Gendry, or at least send word. If he's willing, we'll consider him. If not, we'll find another candidate. He rubbed the back of his neck. It never ends, does it? Tyrion's smile was wry, almost sympathetic. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, Your Grace. Jon said nothing, though his grim expression spoke volumes. Together, they left the great hall, the scattering of scribes bowing as they passed. Tyrion parted ways near the courtyard, saying something about meeting with Maester Wolkan to discuss distribution of food stores for the coming months. Jon found himself alone momentarily, standing at the threshold of the open doors, letting the brisk air wash over him. Outside, the courtyard bustled with a subdued industriousness. Blacksmiths hammered at an anvil. Stable hands guided horses between stalls. Here and there, a soldier tended to battered armor, while a few footmen chatted idly. The day felt normal in a way that had long been absent in the north. He glanced toward the eastern gate, where a covered wagon was being loaded with supplies for Brienne's journey south. She supervised from the side, giving instructions to the men she'd chosen. Jon admired her efficiency and dedication, a knight in spirit as well as name. He crossed the courtyard to speak with her before she departed. She noticed his approach and turned, offering a slight bow of her head. Your Grace, how soon will you leave? Jon asked, eyeing the wagon's contents, mostly dried meats, grain, and a few barrels of fresh water. At first light tomorrow, Brienne replied. I want to avoid traveling through open country in the dead of night. We should make steady progress southward. The roads are still in poor condition, but the snows are thinning. Then Twine? Jon nodded. Safe travels then. I know you'll do the realm proud. She regarded him seriously. I will do everything in my power to ensure these raiders are brought to justice, and the people of the Riverlands can rebuild without fear. I only wish to serve as best I can. He placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of trust. The people deserve a champion. Thank you, Sir Brienne. She inclined her head again and turned back to her preparations, directing the loading of arms and provisions. Jon lingered a moment, reflecting on the swirling complexities of leadership, then eventually made his way toward the keep. He climbed the familiar stairs to the Solar, where Sansa would no doubt be reviewing ledgers or meeting with stewards. Along the way, he exchanged respectful nods with guards who saluted him. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and strangely new, as though Winterfell was itself a different place, now that so many of its halls were dedicated to affairs of the entire kingdom. He found Sansa in the Solar with her steward, a loyal gray-bearded man named Jonas, who had once served their grandfather. They were bent over a wide table strewn with inventories of stored grain and trade lists from White Harbor. Sansa looked up as Jon entered, a faint smile touching her lips, though her eyes held the cool calculation of someone who had learned the cost of every word in every deal. Jon, she greeted, dismissing Jonas with a gentle nod. The steward gathered his parchments and quietly exited, leaving the siblings alone. Sansa. He gave her a small, weary smile. How goes the accounting? She sighed, pushing a stray lock of auburn hair back from her face. It goes. The north was always sparse on supplies, but the long night drained us even more. We'll need to depend on the Vale and the Reach for shipments of grain until our own fields are stable again. Her voice was measured, practical. We have enough for the current population, but if more people migrate north, or if the Lord send more soldiers here, it could strain our reserves. John nodded, stepping closer to scan the ledgers. The stark columns of numbers were daunting. We'll have to set limitations, ensure no one hoards what others need. She agreed, tapping a slender finger on a figure scrawled in ink. Precisely. I've spoken with Tyrion, and we have a plan to bring in shipments from the Mandar region. But shipping and overland transport costs silver, and the crown's coffers aren't exactly overflowing. We'll need to balance trade concessions carefully. He frowned, rubbing his chin. We can't tax the small folk too heavily. They've already suffered so much. Nor should we. But the lords in the south will expect some reciprocity. It's a puzzle, Sansa admitted, setting down her quill. We'll manage, but we must be shrewd about it. Jon studied her face a moment, reflecting on how far she had come from the girl who once dreamed of courtly dances and handsome princes. She carried herself with a calm, poised wisdom now, a regal bearing that belied her youth. I'm grateful for you, he said softly. You understand these things better than I do. I'd be lost without your counsel. A trace of warmth glowed in her eyes. We're family, Jon. And this is our home. We protect it in whatever ways we can. Done? Then he placed a hand over hers for a brief moment, then stepped back. There's another matter. Bandits in the Riverlands. I've sent Brienne with a force to deal with them. Sansa nodded thoughtfully. It's wise to act quickly, or it sets a dangerous precedent. People need to see the crown responding to threats, no matter how small or far away. They need to believe in the stability of this new order. His jaw tightened. Yes, that's exactly it. We've come too far to let chaos take root again. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight behind those words. I have to attend a meeting with Tyrion and Sam about reorganizing the library holdings and some old royal decrees. Will you join us? She shook her head slightly, indicating the tall stacks of parchment. I still have to finalize grain allocations and go over some messages from White Harbor. You go on. I'll catch up later if there's time. He nodded his farewell and departed. The corridor, leading to the library, was lined with new torches, their smoke curling in lazy patterns toward the high ceiling. Once a place of solemn quiet, the library now had the occasional foot traffic of scholars and scribes from across the north, invited by Sam to help preserve history and gather knowledge for the benefit of the entire realm. Sam's idea was to create a northern repository of lore, second only to the Citadel, in order to ensure that vital information remained safe from the politics of Old Town. When Jon stepped through the tall doors, the smell of old books and fresh ink embraced him. Rows of shelves stretched out, laden with tomes salvaged from the ravages of war. Sam stood at a table near the center, immersed in a stack of scrolls. He glanced up, his round face breaking into a broad smile. Jon, he exclaimed. I was just telling Tyrion about some fascinating texts we found in a sealed chest, maps of the Westerlands dating back to before Aegon's conquest, along with some genealogical records that might help us trace the lineage of certain minor houses. Tyrion stood beside him, dwarfed by Sam's enthusiasm and the towering shelves. Yes, Sam has been educating me on the finer points of pre-Targaryen feudalism. I never imagined I'd find anything more tedious than being master of coin. But he's proven me wrong, he joked, though there was a glimmer of genuine curiosity in his eyes. Jon smiled faintly, approaching the table. I'm glad the library is being put to good use. How fare the records from the Citadel? Sam gestured to another pile of books. Maester Walken and I have begun the copying process. We'll keep duplicates here in case anything happens. The Citadel has been cooperative since the war ended, but I don't want all that knowledge concentrated in one location. Jon nodded. Wise Detwar. What of the old royal decrees? Now and... Tyrion retrieved a parchment from near Sam's elbow. We've found some from the reign of King Aerys II, some from Robert Baratheon, and a few from Joffrey's short time on the throne. Most are outdated, but we need to determine which remain legally binding and which should be nullified under your reign. There's a cluster of contradictory land grant decrees, another set concerning the rights of small folk in certain crownland villages, and so on. Jon's expression became pensive. That's a lot. Sam patted the tomes gently. It is, but it's important. We can't just ignore old laws. If we want a stable kingdom, People need to know the legal landscape. We can revise them, revoke them, or reaffirm them. But it must be clear. Neither. John inhaled, glancing at the stacks. Let's set priorities. We'll start with anything that affects the small folk directly. Taxes, land rights, that kind of thing. Then we can move on to the rest. The realm has enough confusion without outdated decrees adding to it. Tyrion grinned. Pragmatic as ever, Your Grace. It will take time, but we'll see it done. Nand and he. Their meeting stretched on, the three men poring over texts, discussing the intricacies of governance. Hours passed in quiet intensity, interrupted only by the occasional scribe arriving with fresh quills or new scrolls. Joan's eyes grew weary from scanning cramped handwriting penned decades or centuries earlier. When they finally paused to eat, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold cuts was brought to them, and they talked more casually. Between bites, Tyrion asked, "Any new word from the Iron Islands?" Jon shook his head. Yara Greyjoy returned after the coronation. She pledged to stand with the crown, but she's been rebuilding her fleet and re-establishing her claim over the Iron Islands. They suffered losses in the war, but not as badly as other regions. For now, we maintain friendly ties. A faint line creased his brow. But the Ironborn have their own ways. They might not trouble the north, but if they decide to raid in Essos or the Westerlands, we'll need to address it. So far, Yara has kept her word, though. Tyrion wiped his mouth with a cloth. I doubt she wants to stir up conflict so soon. The Iron Islands need a chance to recover, just like the rest of us. And Yara strikes me as more practical than many of her predecessors. Let's hope she remains so. Then they returned to their tasks, going deeper into the labyrinth of old decrees. The atmosphere of the library was hushed, but not oppressive, warmed by the faint fire in a nearby hearth. From time to time, Sam would sigh or groan at the complexity of certain edicts, while Tyrion offered wry quips about the folly of past kings. Jon occasionally found his attention wandering to thoughts of simpler days, remembering the feel of cold steel in his hands while training with Robb in the courtyard, or the nights he kept watch atop the wall, seeing nothing but white expanse and a distant horizon. He reminded himself that those simpler days had never truly been simple. Even then, the weight of duty had loomed over him. By the time they finished their work for the afternoon, the light outside had grown dim. A golden hue slanted through the high windows, marking the approach of dusk. Jon stretched his arms, feeling the knot in his shoulders from long hours hunched over the table. Tyrion carefully stacked the parchments. Sam let out a weary yawn. I think that's enough for today, Jon decided. We'll resume tomorrow. Tyrion offered no argument. Sam merely nodded, rubbing his tired eyes. They exited the library, the large doors closing behind them with a resonant thud. In the corridor, candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting elongated shadows on the stone. Tyrion paused, looking thoughtful. I might take a walk outside before I retire, he said. Winterfell has a certain melancholic beauty at twilight. Sam patted his considerable belly. I'm heading to the kitchens to see if the cooks have kept any hot soup. Then maybe an early night. My mind is spinning with old laws and genealogies. Jon managed a small smile. Good night to you both. I'll see you in the morning. They parted ways, and Jon began a quiet trek through Winterfell's corridors. Servants bustled about, lighting torches and preparing for the evening meal in the great hall. The aroma of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread floated through the air, reminding him that he had barely eaten anything substantial all day. Yet an inexplicable restlessness coursed through him, and he decided to bypass the hall altogether. Instead, he made his way to a secluded courtyard near the rear of the castle, an older section less traveled by most. This courtyard was bordered on one side by a low wall that overlooked a small garden space, and on the other by the castle's outer ramparts. The sky overhead was painted in hues of deepening blue and orange, and a light breeze stirred the brittle remnants of winter flowers. He found Arya there, almost as if she had anticipated his arrival, though she was simply leaning against the wall, gazing at the setting sun. She glanced over when he stepped into the courtyard. You're late, she teased quietly. Jon approached, resting his hands on the edge of the wall. "Didn't realize I was expected," he replied. "I had a feeling you'd turn up eventually. You've been shut away in the library all day." He gave her a slight nod. "Sometimes it feels like it never ends. There's always more to read, more to decide, more letters to write." Arya offered him a sidelong look. "Would you prefer being back at the wall, doing your watch duties?" He hesitated, genuinely pondering the question. Memories of the wall washed over him, the unrelenting cold, the camaraderie with his brothers, the constant dread of what lay beyond. "No," he said finally. The threat beyond the wall was real and terrifying. Life was simpler, perhaps, but only because our duty was so narrowly defined. Here, it's everything. Every decision has consequences I can't always see. More. Her gaze flickered to the horizon. "You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can ask." She turned to face him. "I went riding today out past the farms to the west. Ran into a group of travelers heading south. They recognized me. Said they heard tales about the White Wolf crowned in Winterfell. Word of your reign spreads faster than ravens, it seems." Jon raised a brow. "And what did they say about this White Wolf?" A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "They seemed hopeful. They told me it's the first time they've heard of a king who isn't looking for gold or conquest but actually cares whether the people survive the winter. They're not entirely sure what to make of you, but they're optimistic." Jon's chest tightened at that. He turned his gaze outward, noticing how the last vestiges of sunlight painted the distant hills. "Hope? That's the real currency we have right now. If we lose that, everything we fought for goes to ashes." Arya nodded, her posture as lithe and poised as a cat's. "Stay true to yourself, Jon. You've always been who you are, no matter the situation. King or not, you haven't changed inside. People sense that." Benton. He reached out and clasped her shoulder gently, a moment of quiet affection passing between them. "Thank you," he murmured. She gave him a small firm nod before stepping away. "I'm going to check the guards at the northern gate," she said. "Meet me in the hall later if you feel like having a real dinner. You're too thin for a king." He let out a low chuckle as she slipped off into the twilight, silent as a shadow. Left alone, Jon lingered a few minutes more, watching the colors fade from the sky until the stars began to prick through the blue-black canvas overhead. The night brought a different kind of stillness than he remembered from his time in the far north, but there was a kinship to it, the quiet potential that always lay within darkness. He thought back to the long night, to the terror that had nearly consumed them all. It seemed both distant and impossibly near, as if the memories were etched into his skin. Eventually, he tore himself away and headed back inside. He could hear the growing murmur of voices in the great hall where supper was underway. Servants bustled in the corridors, carrying platters of roast fowl, fresh loaves of bread, and steaming vegetables. The scent teased at Jon's hunger, reminding him of his neglected appetite. He decided to join the rest of the household for a meal, hoping to display some semblance of normalcy. Kings too needed to eat. The great hall was bathed in warm light from a multitude of torches and lanterns. The long tables were partially filled with men-at-arms, household knights, and a handful of visitors who had stayed in Winterfell. Sansa sat at the high table, speaking quietly with one of her stewards, while Tyrion, perched on a tall seat, sipped from a goblet of wine, observing the room with thoughtful eyes. Jon settled himself between Sansa and Tyrion, offering a polite greeting to those who rose when he entered. He reached for some bread and a portion of stew, an earthy mix of venison and carrots. Tyrion poured him a modest cup of wine. Sansa discreetly inquired about the day's progress without pressing too hard. The conversation at the high table was muted, overshadowed by the private burdens each carried, yet there was a certain relief in simply sharing a meal together. Now and then, a soldier or messenger approached to deliver a short report or ask a question, and Jon answered as best he could between mouthfuls. After they finished eating, Tyrion stood, bowing slightly to Jon and Sansa before making his way out. Jon assumed he'd retire to his chambers or perhaps indulge in a bit more wine in private. Sansa rose not long after, explaining that she still had letters to read. With a sigh, Jon also left, feeling the call of rest after a long day of endless details. His path took him through the winding corridors to his chambers, where two guards in northern livery stood at attention by the door. They bowed as he entered. Inside, the room was lit by a single lantern and the soft glow of a fire in the hearth. A basin of warm water had been placed on a small table, and a thick quilt was folded neatly across the bed. Ghost lay near the fireplace, lifting his head at Joan's entrance. The Darrow's ears perked, and he gave a soft, contented sound when John knelt to scratch behind them. The crown still rested on its stand, a glint of metal in the lamplight. John regarded it with a mixture of acceptance and weariness. He took off his cloak and draped it over a chair, then ran a hand through his hair, loosening the day's tension. Carefully, he removed his boots, poured some water from the basin into his cupped palm, and washed his face. The fire crackled quietly, providing a gentle backdrop to his thoughts. Each day his king required him to be part warrior, part scholar, part judge. He wondered if any man could meet all those needs. Yet, he had to try. He settled onto the edge of the bed. Ghost shifted closer, resting his head on John's knee. Absently, John stroked the white fur, letting the simple motion ground him. A memory flickered in his mind. A younger self, nervous and excited about joining the Night's Watch, uncertain of what lay ahead. That boy had grown into a man who fought the undead, who loved and lost, who was now tasked with guiding an entire realm out of darkness. Life had a way of twisting paths beyond recognition. Yet here he was, forging ahead, driven by duty and a sense of honor instilled by the man he had always thought to be his father. Before the heaviness of sleep claimed him, his thoughts drifted to the broader world. Brienne would soon be riding for the Riverlands to quell trouble near Harrenhal. Yara Greyjoy was rebuilding her fleet. The Lords of the Reach were navigating the vacuum left by House Tyrell's downfall. The Dorne leadership was still finding its feet, after generations of Martell rule ended so abruptly. And far across the sea, there were rumors, always rumors, of new warlords rising in Essos, or uncertain whispers of what might remain of Daenerys Targaryen's legacy. Each whisper, each rumor, carried the potential to shake the fragile peace now blossoming in Westeros. John closed his eyes, acknowledging that despite all they had overcome, the realm was poised on a razor's edge. But he also felt a faint surge of hope. They had faced the dead and survived. They had crowned him not because he craved power, but because he had proven worthy in their eyes. Tomorrow, he would continue the work, step by step, forging alliances, quelling unrest, rebuilding. If he could uphold the unity that had seen them through the long night, perhaps the living truly could create a better world. Morning came slowly, the sky a muted gray that gave no immediate hint of sun. John rose from his bed, splashed water on his face, dressed in a plain dark tunic and trousers, then pulled on a thick cloak against the morning chill. Outside, the corridors were still quiet, with only a few servants stirring. The castle felt hushed, as though waiting for the day's business to begin. He found his way to the small godswood, drawn by a need for reflection. The weirwood tree stood tall and ancient, its red leaves a startling contrast against the pale bark. The old face carved into the trunk watched him with those strange, timeless eyes. He stepped onto the soft carpet of fallen leaves, each footstep rustling faintly. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. He knelt at the base of the tree, bowing his head, unsure if he was praying or merely centering himself. The old gods did not speak in voices he could hear, but he felt their presence in the hush of the wind and the soft trickle of a nearby stream. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel small and humbled. The burdens of kingship seemed vast, but here, under these ancient boughs, he was reminded that countless generations had come before him, that the land itself witnessed all triumphs and tragedies without judgment. Footsteps approached behind him. He recognized them even before he turned. Light, sure steps, accompanied by the soft hum of steel at a hip. Arya stood there, as still as a specter, watching him with an unreadable expression. He rose to his feet, brushing stray leaves from his cloak. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly, though there was a hint of her usual directness in her tone. Not well, Jon admitted. Too much on my mind. She gave him a small nod. Brienne and her men left at dawn. I saw them off before they headed south. She looked determined. Jon felt a pang of gratitude. Good. That business in the Riverlands needs to be handled quickly. He glanced at the weirwood. I needed a moment here. Been thinking about everything. Nastar. Arya's gaze flicked to the carved face, then back to Jon. We all have. It's a new world we're making, or trying to. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. But we're still here, together. The Starks survived, somehow. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I'm glad you came back, he said, recalling the years they'd been separated, each forging a different path that led to unimaginable trials. It's hard to believe we stand here at all. Arya smiled faintly. I wonder, but I always come home. They stood in silence for a moment, the old godswood bearing witness. Eventually, Arya nodded toward the exit. You have a meeting with Tyrion soon, yes? He allowed a slight grin. Another day of scrolls and decisions. She tipped her head toward the tree. Then take this moment. A breath. Clear your mind. The realm can wait a little longer for its king. Jon gave a small, tired laugh. She had a point. Sometimes, the weight of rule felt suffocating, and a single breath of peace was worth all the gold in Casterly Rock. He closed his eyes, inhaling the cool morning air, letting the ancient quiet of the godswood soothe him. When he opened them again, Arya had already turned, walking away with her silent grace. He followed at a slower pace, the hush of the leaves, a gentle lullaby behind him. By the time he left the godswood, the castle was stirring in earnest. Kitchen servants carried bread and porridge to the hall. Stable hands readied horses for errands, and the blacksmith's forge rang with early hammers. Jon made his way to the council chamber, a modest room adjacent to the great hall, where Tyrion, Sam, and Sansa had begun to gather. A large table dominated the space, draped in maps of the Seven Kingdoms and smaller charts detailing trade routes, harvest estimates, and more. Sansa pored over a letter with furrowed brows. Tyrion sipped a cup of morning ale. Sam was sorting through rolled parchments, occasionally humming to himself. Jon cleared his throat as he entered, signaling his arrival. The conversation quieted, and all eyes turned toward him. He glanced at each of them in turn, thinking of the roles they played in this fragile new kingdom. Let's begin, he said gently, moving to the head of the table. We have a day of tasks ahead, and likely another tomorrow. Sansa laid down the letter she was holding. We've received word from White Harbor, she said. They've resumed shipbuilding. If we can strike a fair deal, we may be able to secure the beginnings of a royal fleet. It won't be large, but it's a start. Tyrion's brows rose. A fleet would give us more reach if we need to secure our coasts. Sam nodded encouragingly. And it might help trade, too. Food and other goods could be brought up from the south by sea, avoiding dangerous roads. Many bandits are still out there. Jon leaned his hands on the table, scanning the map. Let's draft terms for White Harbor. Tax incentives, perhaps a share in future trade profits. I don't want them to feel like we're imposing on them, but we do need their expertise. Sansa took a quill and jotted notes. Understood. They discussed the details of shipbuilding for a time, then moved on to news of the Vale. Tyrion relayed reports that Lord Robert Arryn's health remained delicate, but the Knights of the Vale were largely intact and had turned their attention to fortifying the Bloody Gate. Sam brought up a message from the Citadel, offering additional maesters for Winterfell if needed, though the Citadel expected a stipend in return. Jon weighed the offer, recalling that the North was short on learned healers. Ultimately, he decided to accept the Citadel's proposition, at least for 2 or 3 additional maesters, with the understanding they would help train local apprentices. By midday, they had worked through a mountain of correspondence, with Sansa skillfully navigating each negotiation, Sam referencing historical precedents, and Tyrion adding his seasoned perspective on the politics that might spring from each choice. Jon facilitated, asked questions, and ultimately made decisions when consensus was elusive. Though tedious, it was necessary, each small piece of governance fitting into the larger puzzle of forging a stable realm. After a simple midday meal of stew and bread, they returned to their duties. A messenger arrived from the west, bearing tidings from the remnants of House Bolton's former territories. The land remained scarred, with many refusing to return. Tyrion made a note that the crown might have to encourage resettlement, offering land grants or tax breaks for those willing to rebuild. Jon felt an old anger twist inside him at the mention of Bolton lands, recalling the horrors inflicted by Ramsay. But he kept his composure, reminding himself that it was not the land's fault. People needed homes, fields needed tending, and the sins of one vile man could not condemn the entire region forever. Hours later, the sun began to wane again, the sky turning the color of burnished gold. They paused for a short break, stepping into the courtyard for fresh air. Wind ruffled the banners overhead. Jon noticed Tyrion squinting at a passing cloud with a philosophical frown. "Is it me?" Tyrion asked softly. "Or do the days seem shorter now that we're trying to rebuild the kingdom?" Jon let out a breathy laugh. "The days feel short, the nights feel short. Time itself is a blur." "Nandi?" Sam rubbed his back, looking sympathetic. "We'll manage somehow, one day at a time." They returned inside for the last of the day's tasks, going over a series of smaller issues. Repairs to Winterfell's granaries, an update on the progress of a new marketplace in the Outer Ward, and the details of a minor trade dispute between a northern merchant and a visiting trader from the Westerland. It was well after dark when they finally concluded. Sansa stifled a yawn. Tyrion rubbed his temples. Sam stretched, his spine popping audibly. They parted ways in the corridor, each drifting off to their respective chambers or personal errands. Jon decided to take one last walk around the perimeter of Winterfell. By the light of torches, he climbed the stair to the top of the walls, gazing out over the moonlit landscape. The land beyond the castle shimmered with thin patches of snow, and the forest outlines were etched in silver and black. A faint sense of peace washed over him, though it was tinged with an undercurrent of unresolved tension. The realm was too large, too diverse, for its troubles to be solved in a matter of weeks or months. Yet as he looked at the starlit sky, he remembered something Arya had said. They were still here, the Starks, the North, the living. They had survived. He silently repeated the vow he had made so long ago, to protect the realm of men. Now that vow shaped every breath he took. He would not break under the weight, not after all they had done, all they had sacrificed. He would endure and see Westeros through this uncertain dawn. He turned and descended the steps, letting the night's cold follow him into the warmth of the corridors. He thought of Brienne, riding steadily south with her chosen men, determined to bring justice to the Riverlands. He thought of Gendry, possibly receiving a raven about King's Landing. He thought of the lords scattered across Westeros, each waiting to see how their new king would govern. And he thought of the small folk, the families, the orphans of the war, the farmers coaxing life from the half-frozen soil. They were why he wore the crown, why he labored through ancient decrees and trade agreements, why he pushed aside his own past dreams for the sake of a better future. When he reached his chamber door, he paused, noticing how the torchlight flickered over the wood. The guards bowed their heads. He stepped inside, shut the door quietly, and shrugged off his cloak. Ghost regarded him with silent, watchful eyes. Jon crossed to the fireplace, touching the mantel where a newly carved wolf's head rested. A small gift from a local craftsman. He traced the lines of the carving, feeling the raised grain of the wood. A moment later, he sank into a chair, letting fatigue settle into his bones. He remembered the words spoken at his coronation. "All hail Jon of House Stark, King of the Realm, our King of the Living." They echoed in his memory, a reminder of the trust placed in him. A swirl of images crossed his mind. Faces, battles, heartbreak, fleeting moments of joy, and amid it all, a simple truth. He was still the same man who'd once known nothing. Still learning each day. Still striving to lead with honor. His eyes drifted shut, and in the silent intimacy of his room, the flicker of the hearth was the only witness to his momentary vulnerability. He would rise again tomorrow. The realm would require his presence, his decisions, his careful balance of compassion and strength. He would continue to rely on his sister's keen mind, On Tyrion's political savvy, on Sam's knowledge, on Arya's unflinching loyalty, and on the bravery of knights like Brienne, who carried out the tasks that kept the realm from descending into chaos. In the stillness of this late hour, he allowed himself to believe that they stood on the cusp of a rebirth for Westeros. A chance to build a more unified land from the ashes of war and the chill of death. Ghost padded over, resting his muzzle on Jon's knee. Jon stroked the direwolf's fur absently, eyes half closed. Tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, he would do what needed to be done. He was a king now, not by birthright or even by choice, but by the will of those who recognized his sense of duty. And in that duty, he found purpose. The quiet crackling of the fire lulled him into a state of calm reflection, and for once, he felt a small kernel of peace in his chest. Even as the deep night set in, with the distant hooting of owls and the faint rustle of wind against the ancient walls, Winterfell seemed to breathe with renewed life. The old stones had seen so many Starks come and go, had witnessed tragedy and triumph in equal measure. Now, they bore witness to a new king who carried the blood of House Stark and House Targaryen, a man shaped by hardship and compassion. In that quiet chamber, as Ghost stood sentinel and the fire burned low, Jon Snow resolved to meet the coming days with the same resolve he had shown in battle. For the living, and for all they had lost, he would strive to be worthy of the crown they had placed upon his head.